Right, so I've been putting off making this one for ages, mostly because once I start talking about SpongeBob, I genuinely don't know how to stop. But here we are, 100 SpongeBob theories, some of them properly confirmed by the actual writers, some of them deep Reddit excavation that I find weirdly convincing, and a few that are just daft enough to make me laugh while I'm explaining them to you. I should say up front, this isn't a ranked list and there's no big reveal at the end. It's just 100 bits and pieces about a show that's been running since 1999, told in whatever order feels natural. So whenever you happen to nod off, that's completely fine. You haven't missed anything. The next one isn't building on the last one. Come back to it whenever. A bit of housekeeping before I get going. Some of this is genuinely confirmed, straight from the people who made the show. Some of it is fan theory dressed up as fact. And I'll try to be honest about which is which as we go, because I think that's more interesting than pretending everything is gospel. I'll also say, since I know a fair few of you watching this are probably half tucked in already with the lights off, there's nothing here that needs your full attention. No quiz at the end, no twist you'll regret missing. Treat it the way you'd treat a mate telling you a long, slightly rambling story about a thing they're obsessed with. The kind of conversation where it's perfectly fine to lose the thread for a minute and pick it back up wherever you land. Right, let's get into it, starting with where this whole sponge-shaped world actually came from. Theory 1. SpongeBob wasn't invented by a comedy writer or an advertising person trying to sell toys. He was invented by an actual marine biologist. Stephen Hillenburg studied natural resource planning with an emphasis on marine resources at Humboldt State, and after he graduated, he spent 3 years teaching marine biology at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point. His job was teaching kids about tide pools, tide pool ecology, nautical history, the whole lot. And he noticed something while he was doing it, which is that children are absolutely obsessed with the weird little creatures that live in those rock pools. That observation is basically the entire DNA of the show. Theory 2. To help teach his students, Hillenburg drew a comic called The Intertidal Zone. It had a host character called Bob the Sponge, who at that point looked like an actual sponge, not a kitchen one. There was also a co-host called Rocky the Shrimp. He never managed to get the comic published properly, but it nagged at him enough that he eventually left teaching to study animation instead. So in a roundabout way, SpongeBob exists because a comic about tide pools didn't sell. Theory 3, and this one always makes me smile a bit. When Hillenburg first sat down to design the character properly, he drew a realistic sea sponge. Looked exactly like you'd expect, sort of lumpy and organic. But then, almost as an afterthought, he sketched a square kitchen sponge instead. And apparently, it just looked so funny to him that he knew immediately that was the character. So the actual shape of SpongeBob, the bit that makes him instantly recognizable on a lunchbox from across the room, came from a doodle that was meant to be a joke version. Not the real pitch. Theory 4, he was nearly called SpongeBoy. That was the original name, right through development. But there was already a mop brand using something close to that name, so very close to production, Hillenburg had to swap it. He kept Bob specifically because he was worried that if he dropped Sponge from the name entirely, kids might assume the character was a block of cheese, which, fair enough, square and yellow does suggest cheese before it suggests sea sponge. Theory 5. A few details from Hillenburg's actual life got folded straight into the show without much disguise. During his summers as a young man, he worked as a fry cook and a lobster boiler at a seafood restaurant in Maine. That's SpongeBob's job, basically lifted wholesale. Mr. Krabs is reportedly based on a manager Hillenburg had at a sea-themed restaurant. And Pearl, the teenage whale, apparently comes from his time supervising whale-watching trips as part of his marine biology work. Even SpongeBob's slightly gappy, nerdy teeth are said to be modelled on what Hillenburg looked like as a kid. Theory 6. The narrator character, Frenchie, the one who pops up occasionally doing the posh diving helmet narration, is a direct homage to Jacques Cousteau. If you look closely, he wears a red beanie under his diving helmet, which was Cousteau's signature bit of kit. There's even a bit where SpongeBob impersonates Frenchie and puts on the same red beanie. It's a small detail, but once you clock it, you can't really unsee it. Theory 7, and this is the big one, the one most people have at least half heard. Bikini Bottom is named after Bikini Atoll, which is a real place in the Marshall Islands, and it's not just a name coincidence. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated dozens of nuclear weapons at Bikini Atoll as part of Cold War testing, including the Castle Bravo test in 1954, which was something like 1,000 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. The residents of the atoll were displaced and never properly able to return because of the radiation. It's a genuinely grim bit of 20th century history, and it's sitting directly underneath a children's cartoon about a sponge who flips burgers. Theory 8 builds straight on from that. A Reddit user originally laid the theory out properly. The idea that Bikini Bottom's residents are essentially the result of decades of radiation exposure underneath the atoll, which is why you've got talking crabs and singing starfish, and a snail with the temperament of a cat. It's a fun, slightly unsettling read of the show, and for years it sat purely in fan theory territory. Theory 9. Then it stopped being just a theory. In an interview with Esquire, Mr. Lawrence, who voices Plankton and has written a fair number of episodes, was asked about it directly, and he just confirmed it outright. Said it was absolutely true, and that part of the fun of making the show was seeing how far they could push that concept without ever saying it out loud on screen. Roger Bumpass, who plays Squidward, was sat right there and said he'd been telling people for years it wasn't true, which I think is a brilliant bit of accidental radio. Theory 10, and this is where it gets a bit darker than I expected. Lawrence didn't stop at confirming the nuclear angle. He went further and said that, in his understanding, the surface world above Bikini Bottom is essentially gone. That the world upstairs is gone were more or less his words, which is a properly bleak thing to say about a kid's show, and also doesn't quite square with what's actually on screen. There's an episode called Frankendoodle from season 2, where a human artist in a rowboat is clearly alive and well up on the surface. David Hasselhoff turns up in the first movie. Patchy the pirate, a live-action human, has been a recurring bit since season 2, so I take the everyone up there is dead version with a pinch of salt, more writer's room flourish than strict canon. I think what's actually happening with that comment is fairly ordinary. The kind of thing that happens when someone's been working on a fictional world for decades and starts speaking about its internal logic with more certainty than the show itself has ever committed to on screen. Writers develop private headcanon about their own universes all the time, and it doesn't automatically become official just because it's said out loud in an interview. The show's actual broadcast history simply doesn't support a fully depopulated surface world, regardless of what any one person involved happens to believe privately. Theory 11. One of the more visually specific bits of evidence people point to is the explosion shape. One of the actual nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll was detonated underwater and photographed, and the resulting shape, that distinctive, mushrooming underwater plume, is said to be the same shape the show reuses for pretty much every cartoon explosion across its run. I haven't personally gone frame by frame to verify that one, but it's a nice detail if it holds up. Even setting that specific visual claim aside, it's genuinely true that explosions of one kind or another are everywhere in this show, far more than you'd expect from something aimed primarily at small children. Krabby Patty grills explode, boats explode, science experiments explode. Arguments occasionally end in literal explosions with no real cause given. Whether or not every single one is a deliberate nod to the atoll's history, there's at least a consistent visual vocabulary of sudden underwater blasts running through the whole series that lines up suspiciously well with the setting's supposed origins. Theory 12, a smaller offshoot. Some fans have pointed out that other underwater cities mentioned in the show, places like New Kelp City and Las Vegas, presumably exist under the same logic, all clustered somewhere in that general patch of Pacific Ocean, which would mean the whole show's geography is essentially contained within the fallout zone of the test site, tidy in a slightly grim way. Theory 13 is a much gentler one, almost a palate cleanser after all that radiation talk. There's a separate theory about why SpongeBob and Squidward's houses look the way they do. A pineapple and a giant stone tiki head sat right next to each other. The idea is that a sunken ship carrying tiki bar decorations, the sort of thing with paper lanterns and carved heads and fake pineapples, went down nearby, and the residents just repurposed whatever washed up as actual houses. It's not confirmed by anyone, but it's a nice bit of world-building logic for two genuinely odd-looking buildings. Theory 14, and I'll leave this section here. There's a broader reading some critics have put forward where Mr. Krabs represents corporate pollution, Patrick represents a sort of lazy Western indifference to environmental damage, and Squidward is the lone voice calling for people to actually care about it, constantly ignored. I don't think the writers sat down and planned an allegory, to be honest, that reads a bit too neat for a show that was mostly written for jokes and timing, but it's the kind of thing that shows up when you've got a marine biologist quietly steering a children's cartoon for years. The environmental stuff isn't an accident, even if the metaphor is being read in after the fact. I kept finding bits while researching the origins that I didn't want to leave out, so let me fold a handful of them in here before moving on properly. The actual idea for SpongeBob, in some form, apparently dates back as far as 1986, while Hillenburg was still working at the Marine Institute, well over a decade before the show ever made it to screen. That's a proper long gestation period for a character who, on the surface, looks like he was dreamed up in an afternoon. Hillenburg's work before SpongeBob is worth a mention too. He spent a few years on Rocko's Modern Life, another Nickelodeon show, working his way up to creative director by its final season. He directed an episode there called Fish and Chumps, where the human characters go fishing while completely unaware that two anthropomorphic sea creatures are quietly trying to catch them from underwater. Looking back, that's basically a dry run for the entire premise he'd built a few years later, just told from the other direction. He also picked up a few honours over the years that don't get mentioned much outside fan circles. An accolade from Heal the Bay, specifically recognising his work raising awareness of marine life, and a television animation award from the National Cartoonists Society. Proper recognition, in other words, not just from the cartoon world, but from people who cared about the ocean side of what he was doing too, which feels appropriate given how the whole thing started. It's worth pausing on the real history behind the nuclear theory too, since I think it deserves to be told properly rather than just gestured at. The actual residents of Bikini Atoll, around 160 of them, were moved off their islands back in 1946 and told the relocation would be temporary, that they'd be allowed home again once testing finished. In the 1970s, a few hundred of them were in fact allowed to return, but within a handful of years, by 1978, they were removed a second time, after testing showed they'd absorbed more radioactive cesium from their own environment than any other recorded human population at that point. They still haven't been able to move back properly even now, because the contamination is expected to linger for thousands of years yet. It's a genuinely heavy piece of real-world history sitting underneath the name of a children's cartoon, and I think it's worth saying plainly rather than just folding it into a fun fact, because the people behind that real history are still living with the consequences of it today. And to close out the origins properly, it's worth knowing a bit about how this all actually started on screen. The pilot episode itself, called Help Wanted. Tom Kenny has described it as a near-perfect introduction, precisely because of how quickly and economically it establishes the entire cast, who SpongeBob is, who Squidward is, how the Krusty Krab works, all inside one tight episode, rather than a slow padded out origin story. It's also one of the rare instances across the show's run where the full main cast recorded their lines together as a proper ensemble in one room, rather than separately, which several of the actors involved have pointed to since as part of why that very first episode still holds up as well as it does, full of small spontaneous lines that became instantly quotable, asking whether mayonnaise counts as an instrument, asking whether this is where everyone starts kicking. Neither of those lines reads as scripted comedy gold on paper. They work because the cast was clearly having a genuinely good time together in that room, right from the very first take. Now, since we're on the topic of how this whole world is put together, let's talk a bit about the characters themselves, because the ages genuinely don't add up, and I find that more charming than annoying. Theory 15. There's an episode, Sleepy Time, where SpongeBob's driver's license appears on screen for a second, and it lists his date of birth as the 14th of July, 1986. The show premiered in 1999. If you do that maths properly, SpongeBob would have been about 13 years old when he started working at the Krusty Krab in the pilot episode, which is a slightly uncomfortable bit of arithmetic for a show that also has him going on dates and living entirely alone in his own house. Theory 16. Hillenburg himself apparently wanted SpongeBob to read as an adult, just an adult with the imagination and energy of a kid, which is part of why boating school exists as a plot device, rather than him going to an actual school. It lets him be a grown-up who still gets to fail driving tests and act daft, without the show having to commit to him being either fully a child or fully a responsible adult. Theory 17, and this one properly complicates things. The prequel spin-off, Camp Coral, sets SpongeBob and Patrick at exactly 10 years old, attending a summer camp together, which retroactively suggests the original series SpongeBob is meant to read as fully grown, since Camp Coral is meant to be his childhood, not his current timeline. So depending on which bit of the franchise you trust more, SpongeBob is either 13 or in his 20s or somewhere around 40 if you count his driver's license date against more recent episodes. Nobody really agrees, and I don't think the writers particularly want you to settle it. I'd argue the inconsistency itself is fairly low stakes compared to most continuity arguments, since nothing about the comedy actually depends on the audience knowing SpongeBob's precise age at any given moment. Plenty of long-running franchises get into genuine trouble when their timelines stop making sense, because the plot starts leaning on specific ages or dates to work. SpongeBob never really does that, which is probably why the age debate has stayed a fun bit of trivia rather than the kind of plot hole that actively undermines an episode. Theory 18. Patrick has his own bit of deep lore that I quite like. In the episode SB-129, there's a primitive ancestor of his that appears, sometimes called Primitive Star, basically a Patrick from a much earlier, less articulate era, who communicates in grunts rather than full sentences. There's a second prehistoric ancestor called Pater, who shows up in a different episode, looking a bit more developed, but still very much a caveman version of the character. It's a small thing, but it means Patrick's family line in this universe stretches back further than most of the other characters' established backstories. Worth saying a bit more about SB-129 itself, since it's one of the stranger episodes the show ever produced. Squidward accidentally locks himself in a freezer for what turns out to be thousands of years, and wakes up in a far future version of Bikini Bottom before eventually being flung backward into prehistory entirely, which is where the primitive Patrick and primitive SpongeBob come from. It's a proper science fiction time travel plot dropped into the middle of a show about a fry cook, and the prehistoric versions of the cast only exist on screen because of one very specific, very odd bit of structure in that single episode. Theory 19. As for whether Patrick is actually older than SpongeBob, the show has never pinned it down cleanly, but there are little clues people point to: his slightly deeper voice, his height compared to SpongeBob, the fact that in some flashbacks they're shown as babies around the same era. Most fan breakdowns put him as roughly the same age or very slightly older, never by much. Theory 20. Squidward gets a similar treatment. Background characters occasionally call him boy or young man in older episodes, which doesn't fit with how grumpy and settled he reads as a character. Most informal fan age charts put him somewhere in his 30s to 40s depending on which season you're using as your reference point. Generally, a fair bit older than SpongeBob and Patrick, but younger than Mr. Krabs. Part of why Squidward reads so much older than he's apparently meant to be probably comes down to performance rather than writing. His voice is pitched low and tired. His posture in the animation is permanently slouched, and his general outlook on life is exhausted in a way that genuinely reads as middle-aged regardless of what any background line of dialogue might suggest. Vocal performance and body language can override a stated age fairly easily, and Squidward is a good example of a character whose acting choices have quietly won out over his canon details. Theory 21. Mr. Krabs has an actual confirmed birth year, the 30th of November, 1942, which would put him in his late 50s when the show begins. That's one of the more solid anchor points the fandom has because it isn't just inferred from background dialogue, it's an on-screen detail. Theory 22. Pearl's age gets nailed down too. She turns 16 in the episode Whale of a Birthday. People use that as another anchor point to back-calculate roughly when Mr. Krabs would have had her, and how the rest of the timeline might fit together. Though it gets complicated fast because nobody can agree how old the Krusty Krab building itself is supposed to be. Theory 23. And I think this is honestly the right way to think about the whole question. Hillenburg apparently resisted pinning down hard ages for most of the cast precisely because it would limit the kind of stories you could tell. If SpongeBob is locked at exactly 22, you can't really do an episode where he behaves like a 13-year-old without it feeling odd. Keeping it vague lets the writers dial the maturity up or down, episode to episode, depending on what's funniest. Theory 24. Just a small closing thought on this one. Gary the Snail gets a confirmed birth year in some materials, the 27th of November 1989, making him about 9 when the show starts, which would make Gary, in pure number of years terms, very nearly the most senior member of the household, even though he's the one being treated like a pet. The more you dig into the age question, the messier it gets, in a good way. The Camp Coral spin-off doesn't just retcon the ages, it actually retcons how SpongeBob and Sandy first met, giving them a proper shared camp history together that the original series never really established. It's the kind of quiet continuity shuffle long-running franchises do all the time once enough spin-offs pile up, where the newest piece of media casually rewrites a detail nobody had thought to lock down in the first place. For what it's worth, when fans have actually sat down and tried to build a full age chart for the whole cast rather than just the main few, the estimates spread out properly. Mr. Krabs and Plankton landing somewhere in their 70s by some readings, SpongeBob and Patrick anywhere from their early 20s to their 40s, depending which clues you weight most heavily, Squidward somewhere in the middle, and Sandy usually placed close to SpongeBob's age, or a touch younger. None of these charts agree with each other in the details, which I think is sort of the point. A show that's deliberately vague about ages is always going to produce a fandom that argues about it forever. There's a related running gag worth mentioning here too, tied to SpongeBob's general level of adulthood, the boating school itself. Mrs. Puff has been trying and consistently failing to get SpongeBob through his driving test for the entire run of the show, a running gag that stayed remarkably stable for over 2 decades. He fails, she's left visibly traumatized by whatever chaos he's just caused, and the next episode, resets the whole arrangement back to square one without ever quite explaining why she keeps letting him back into the car. It's one of the cleaner examples of the show simply choosing comic consistency over any kind of real-world logic, and somehow it never gets old. But talking a bit about money now, because Mr. Krabs has a properly detailed backstory once you start digging, and most of it is sadder than the show ever really lets on. Theory 25. Crabs and plankton weren't always enemies. In the special episode, Friend or Foe, it's shown that they were childhood best friends. And not just casually either. They were science class lab partners at school. Two poor kids from the same background, apparently both hungry to get out of it. I think that's the detail that makes their whole rivalry land differently once you know it. It's not two strangers who happen to compete, it's an actual broken friendship. Theory 26. The two of them tried going into business together as young men, opening some sort of burger stand. Their very first customer, a character called Old Man Jenkins, ended up getting food poisoning from whatever they served him. Crabs and plankton blamed each other for it, started fighting over the recipe, and in the chaos, a bunch of random ingredients ended up getting knocked into the meat mixture. That argument, that mess, is apparently where the Krabby Patty formula actually comes from. Plankton walked away from the whole disaster with exactly one ingredient out of the final recipe, which was chum. Everything else went to Krabs. Theory 27. Before any of that, Krabs apparently spent time in the Navy. There's a recurring bit of lore where he earns the nickname Armour Abs Krabs from his crewmates on account of how hard his shell is. He's said to have worked his way up to head chef on a ship referred to as the SS Diarrhea, which fine, very on brand for this show's sense of humour. Theory 28, and this is the one I find genuinely a bit moving for a kid's cartoon. In the episode Krusty Krab training video, there's a line that states, almost in passing, that after the war, Krabs spent time secluded in what's described as a deep depression that seemed endless. That's the actual wording used. It's not dwelt on, the show moves past it quickly, but it's sitting there in the official material. A war veteran character who came home and struggled before eventually pulling himself together and building a restaurant out of an old retirement home he bought cheap. Fans have spent a fair bit of time speculating about exactly which real-world conflict that period might map onto, given his birth year puts him at the right age for a few different ones. Though obviously, the show never names anything specific, it just leaves the detail there in the background. Krabs, apparently, picked up the nickname Armour Abs Krabs during his time at sea, on account of how hard his shell was said to be, and there's a recurring bit of pride he takes in that physical toughness even decades later, flexing for approval, bringing it up unprompted, treating it as a defining achievement from a period of his life he otherwise tends to avoid talking about directly. It reads like a man who's much more comfortable being proud of his body than he is being honest about what that period actually cost him. Theory 29. Lighter territory now. The actual Krabby Patty secret formula has had bits of itself revealed across the show in dribs and drabs over 20-odd years. Almost like the writers enjoy teasing it out. Flour gets confirmed at one point, barnacle shavings, turmeric, salt turns up in a different episode. There's a recurring nod to love being one of the ingredients, which is more sentiment than chemistry, but it's stated more than once. And in Friend or Foe, it's revealed that a pinch of chum, fish meat essentially, is part of it too, which directly undercuts the occasional claim from the production side that the patties contain no meat whatsoever. Theory 30. There's a properly elaborate episode, Plankton's Army, where after literally 25 years of trying, Plankton finally manages to steal the formula, using an entire family of identical planktons to overwhelm the restaurant all at once. He gets the recipe book in his hands, at last. And the final ingredient he reads out, after 2.5 decades of scheming, is plankton. As in his own species, as an ingredient. Understandably, this sends him and his whole extended family running for the hills. it later turns out that particular book was a decoy anyway, with the real formula sitting under Crab's mattress at home the entire time, which is either a very good twist or a slightly cruel one, depending on how much you feel for the poor bloke. Theory 31. The fan theory people bring up most when this topic comes up. Some viewers have noticed that Pearl, Krabs' daughter, is a whale, while Krabs himself is a crab, and there's never been any real explanation of her mother or how that pairing came about. Combine that with the fact that a single dead whale sinking to the seafloor can genuinely sustain an entire deep-sea ecosystem for years in real life, and you get a theory that's gone round for a while suggesting the actual secret ingredient might be whale. It's never been confirmed, and I don't think it ever will be, but it's a properly dark bit of speculation dressed up as a throwaway joke theory, which I think is exactly the kind of thing this fandom does best. Theory 32. The safe containing the formula moves around a fair bit across the show's run, starting under Krab's mattress at home before eventually settling into a proper safe at the restaurant. SpongeBob is apparently the only one who knows the combination, and at one point he ties that knowledge to a specific memory involving Squidward, just so he can never forget it, even if his memory gets wiped, which has actually happened to him on screen more than once. There's something fairly touching about that specific choice, tying the most commercially valuable secret in Bikini Bottom to a memory about a friendship, rather than to a number or a written note. It means that protecting the formula and protecting his relationship with Squidward have become structurally the exact same act for SpongeBob, whether the writers meant it that deliberately or not. Theory 33. As for Karen, Plankton's computer wife, there's a fair bit of quiet tragedy in her position too, if you think about it for more than a second. She's vastly more capable than Plankton in almost every practical sense, frequently the one actually doing the analysis or cracking the formula herself, and yet she's stuck married to a man whose entire personality is built around one obsession he can never actually achieve. In one episode, she does manage to get the formula herself, only for her circuits to overload and erase it before Plankton ever gets to see it, which is such a specifically unlucky bit of writing that I have to assume someone in that writer's room found it genuinely funny to put a married couple through. Karen being a computer rather than a living creature adds an extra layer to all of this that I don't think gets discussed enough. She's not just married to someone obsessed with an unreachable goal, she's also, by design, smarter and more capable than the organic creatures around her, stuck in a domestic arrangement that was never really built with her actual strengths in mind. It's a strange, slightly melancholy bit of science fiction logic hiding inside what's mostly played for comedy. Theory 34. Plankton's actual size, just 1 inch tall by most official measurements, makes his entire decades-long campaign against Krabs even funnier once you sit with it properly. He's a single-celled organism with the ego and the scheming brain of, by his own estimation, a world conqueror. Hillenburg apparently designed him as the ultimate underdog in a fairly literal physical sense, and I think that contrast, tiny body, towering ambition, does more comedic work than people give it credit for. There's a fuller picture worth giving to Karen and Plankton's marriage too, while we're here, because the formula near miss I just mentioned wasn't actually a one-off. There's at least one other episode where Karen manages to extract the formula a second time, only to wipe it from her own memory afterward. This time, out of pure frustration, after Plankton ruins what was meant to be a proper date night between the two of them. So twice across the show's run, by my count, Karen has held the one thing her husband has spent his entire existence chasing, and lost it both times for reasons that have nothing to do with Krabs at all and everything to do with Plankton's own behaviour. I think that's a properly bleak bit of comedy writing if you sit with it for more than a few seconds. A marriage where the husband's life's work keeps slipping away because of his own choices, not his enemy's defences. Theory 35, a smaller closing one. Krabs and Mrs. Puff have an ongoing romantic relationship across the show that gets surprisingly little focus given how long it's been going on, often treated as background flavour rather than an actual plotline, which always struck me as a slightly underused bit of the world. Theory 36, and I'll leave Krabs there for now. For all the jokes about his greed, and there are a lot of them, there's a single father storyline running underneath it the whole time. A crab raising a whale daughter on his own, doing whatever it takes to make her happy, even while he's pinching every penny everywhere else in his life. It's one of those details that doesn't change the comedy of the character at all, but it does add a bit of weight underneath it, if you've watched enough episodes back to back. Just to close this section out properly, what I find genuinely well constructed about Krabs as a character is how consistently those two halves of him sit side by side without the show ever needing to resolve the contradiction. He'll shortchange his own staff one scene and then spend a small fortune on Pearl's birthday the next, and neither version cancels the other out. He's not a greedy man who secretly loves his daughter, and he's not a loving father who happens to be greedy as a quirk. Both things are simply fully true of him at once, which is harder to write convincingly than it sounds. A few last bits on the crabs and plankton side of things before we move along. The Krusty Krab building itself has its own little origin story tucked away. Krabs apparently bought it as a bankrupt retirement home, originally called the Rusty Krab, and the rename was about as simple as adding a single letter, swapping the R for a K to land on Krusty, which also happens to echo the name of his old pirate ship. It's a small bit of wordplay doing double duty as both a business name and a quiet nod to his earlier life at sea. There's also a detail about Krab's own family history that tends to get glossed over. The implication that he comes from a long line of pirates, with a grandfather often referred to as Redbeard, who apparently raised him for a stretch and instilled in him a fairly blunt piece of family wisdom, that a pirate never lies, which is a slightly funny piece of inherited values to hand down to a man whose entire adult personality is built around bending the truth for profit wherever he can get away with it. Plankton's own origins as a character are worth a quick detour too. Hillenburg originally conceived him as a fairly minor, one-off antagonist, somebody to cause trouble in a single episode rather than a recurring fixture. It was apparently the writing team realizing how much comedic mileage there was in his booming voice and his wildly oversized ego, despite being barely an inch tall, that turned him into the permanent rival he became. Sometimes the characters a show ends up leaning on hardest weren't the ones built to last in the first place. A small visual detail on the formula itself before we move off the subject entirely. Whatever the actual ingredients turn out to be, the formula's physical presentation has stayed consistent for years, written out on a slip of paper and kept inside a small transparent blue glass bottle sealed with a plain cork stopper. It first properly appeared on screen this way, in an episode called Imitation Krabs, and that exact image, the little blue bottle, has stuck as the formula's visual signature ever since, regardless of which storyline happens to be putting it at risk that week. But here's a fun detail, since we've just been talking about characters who don't get enough credit. I think Squidward might be the most misunderstood resident of Bikini Bottom, and not in the way the show wants you to think. Theory 37. Squidward considers himself a serious artist, and the show spends most of its runtime treating that as a joke. His clarinet playing is mocked, his self-portraits get rejected by art dealers, his sculptures get laughed at. But if you actually track the moments where his work is shown in proper detail, rather than just reacted to, the picture gets more complicated. At one point, out of pure rage rather than careful effort, he accidentally produces a sculpture that's apparently a near-perfect, family-friendly recreation of Michelangelo's David. That's not the work of someone with no talent. That's the work of someone with real technical skill and absolutely catastrophic taste in subject matter. which, if you think about it, describes a lot of real working artists too. Theory 38. There's an episode, Best Day Ever, where Squidward actually performs a full clarinet concert and plays beautifully, getting a standing ovation from a packed crowd, with SpongeBob sat right there on the guest list, despite Squidward supposedly despising him. It's one of maybe 3 or 4 moments across the whole series where his musical ability is shown working properly rather than as comic failure, and it sits oddly next to every other episode where his playing is presented as actively painful to listen to. Squidward's painting habit gets the same treatment as his clarinet playing, mocked relentlessly in universe, while occasionally producing something that's genuinely competent. The bulk of his collection is self-portraits, dozens upon dozens of them, painted in wildly different styles, abstract, impressionist, surrealist, as though he's working his way through an entire art history syllabus purely to flatter himself. It's narcissistic, certainly, but it also suggests a level of technical range that none of his neighbours ever bother to acknowledge. Theory 39, and I quite like this reading of it. Most of the breakdowns I've come across land on the same conclusion, that Squidward isn't actually untalented. He's just lazy about practicing and weirdly arrogant about needing to. He wants to skip straight to being recognised as a genius without doing the unglamorous repetition that genuine skill requires, which again is a properly relatable flaw for a fictional octopus to have. Theory 40, a small production detail I only found out recently and quite liked. The crappy clarinet playing isn't performed by a voice actor doing a deliberately bad impression. There's an actual clarinetist, a chap called Brad Caro, who's been recording Squidward's clarinet bits since the very start of the show, over 2 decades now, and he still gets called in for new episodes when they need it. He's apparently said that everything he plays for Squidward is improvised on the spot, which technically makes him the credited owner of every single one of those terrible original compositions. He moved up to Sitka in Alaska at some point and still runs his own jazz radio show there on the side, which I think is a lovely little life for the man behind one of the most mocked musical performances in children's television. Theory 41. Despite the name, Squidward isn't actually a squid. He's an octopus. The show has confirmed this directly more than once, and you can see it in the design if you look properly. The round head shape and the eye shape match an octopus far more than a squid, which would have a longer, more triangular head and round pupils rather than rectangular ones. The animators apparently gave him 6 limbs instead of the full 8 an octopus would have, purely because 8 tentacles would have been a nightmare to animate consistently across hundreds of episodes. The naming choice is genuinely odd once you sit with it, calling an octopus character Squidward rather than something that actually reflects what he is. Whether that was a deliberate joke baked in from day one, or just a name that sounded right and stuck regardless of accuracy, nobody involved seems to have ever fully explained, which is fairly fitting for a character whose entire identity is built around being slightly wrong about most things, including, apparently, his own species' public branding. Theory 42. There's a quieter, sadder detail buried in his background that doesn't get brought up much. In one episode, it's mentioned in passing that as a kid, Squidward had to sit near the bins at lunch, which is about as efficient a way of establishing this character was unpopular at school, as you can manage in a single throwaway line. It does a lot of quiet work explaining why he's so prickly and so desperate for outside validation as an adult. Once you've clocked that detail, a fair amount of his adult behaviour starts to read differently. The obsession with status, the constant need to prove himself against his old school rival Squilliam, the way validation from a crowd seems to matter more to him than genuine connection with the people actually around him day to day. None of that excuses how he treats SpongeBob and Patrick, but it does at least explain where the appetite for outside approval originally came from. There's a nice bit of deep ancestry on Squidward's side too, tying back to Patrick's prehistoric relatives from a little earlier. It turns out Squidward has his own equivalent tucked away in that same prehistoric continuity, a caveman-era ancestor generally referred to as Squog, who apparently got on far better with Patrick's ancestor Patar than present-day Squidward gets on with present-day Patrick. Whatever soured between those two families happened somewhere in the last few 100,000 years, not at the very start, which I think is a genuinely funny bit of evolutionary irony to have buried this deep into a kid's cartoon. Theory 43, and I'll wrap up this section here. I think the honest version of Squidward's story is that he's a genuinely talented person who got it into his head very early that talent alone should be enough, without the practice or the patience that usually has to come with it. And the show just keeps putting him next to SpongeBob, who has neither talent nor self-awareness, but somehow ends up happy anyway. That contrast is doing more of the comedic and emotional work in this show than I think people give it credit for. Just a couple more on Squidward before we move along, since I genuinely think he's the most underrated character to dig into. When Squidward eventually moves into a different neighbourhood for a stretch, a place called Tentacle Acres, there's a nice little beat where he joins a proper clarinet trio there and manages to play along without ruining it for anyone else, suggesting that surrounded by people who actually share his taste, rather than SpongeBob and Patrick constantly interrupting him, he's perfectly capable of holding his own as a musician. It's a small environmental explanation for a character whose failures the show usually plays as pure personal incompetence. And there's a birthday detail worth tucking in here too. His birthday's given as the 9th of October, which isn't hugely important on its own, but it's one of the few main cast members with a clean, specific date attached rather than just a vague age range fans have had to reconstruct from background dialogue. Since we're already deep into character backstories, let's talk a bit about the rest of the household, starting with the bloke who lives under a rock. Theory 44. Patrick genuinely does live under a literal rock, not a rock-shaped house. An actual boulder sat on the seafloor with apparently nothing underneath it but his living space. Compared to a converted pineapple and a repurposed tiki head, it's somehow the strangest housing choice of the three. And the show has never really explained how he affords it, fits furniture in it, or keeps it from flooding. Theory 45. We touched on his prehistoric ancestors earlier, the primitive version from SB-29, and the slightly more developed caveman version, called Pata, from a different episode. Worth circling back to say that of the three main characters, Patrick's species seems to have the longest and most thoroughly documented history in this universe, which is a strange bit of trivia for the character generally treated as the daftest member of the group. Theory 46. Gary the snail communicates entirely through a meowing sound, which is the show's most consistent and best-running joke about how Bikini Bottom rewrites land animal logic for an underwater setting. Cats are land pets who chase mice. Snails are slow garden creatures that most people barely register, and the show just swaps their personalities wholesale. Snail with cat attitude, treated exactly like a cat by everyone in universe. Fed, bathed, occasionally entered into races. Beyond just the meowing, Gary gets treated as a genuinely independent character with his own interests rather than a purely reactive pet. He's shown watching westerns on television, getting visibly bored, having his own preferences about food and company that SpongeBob has to actually negotiate with rather than simply dictate. For an animal whose entire vocabulary is one repeated sound, the writers managed to give him a surprisingly distinct personality through nothing but posture, timing, and reaction shots. Theory 47. Sandy Cheeks gets treated with a bit more scientific seriousness than most of the cast, which tracks given Hillenberg's actual background in marine biology. Her tree dome, her gear, her general approach to problems leans toward genuine engineering logic, even when the actual science underpinning it is nonsense. It's not hard science by any means, but there's a thin layer of real plausibility running under her character that most of Bikini Bottom doesn't bother with. Theory 48, a fan theory rather than anything confirmed. Some viewers have connected Sandy's general design, an air-breathing land mammal living inside a domed, oxygenated environment underwater, to the real history of animals being sent up during early aerospace and nuclear testing programs. Chipmunks and other small mammals being used in various Cold War era tests around that period. It's a loose connection, more vibes than evidence, but it fits the general nuclear undertone the show seems to enjoy leaning into without ever stating it outright. Theory 49. Patrick living under a rock while SpongeBob and Squidward live in proper structures does raise a genuine, unanswered question about Bikini Bottom's general approach to housing and property. Nobody questions it on screen. It's just accepted as normal that one resident's entire home is an unmodified boulder. There's never been any indication Patrick pays for the rock, applies for it, or has any formal claim to it whatsoever, beyond simply having always lived there, which puts him in a strange position relative to his two neighbours, both of whom seem to have gone through some recognisable version of buying or repurposing their homes. Patrick's rock reads less like property and more like something he simply always belonged under, the way a hermit crab belongs in whatever shell happens to fit. Theory 50. Lighter again. Sandy's Texas pride shows up constantly as a character trait. Twangy accent, karate skills, an instinct to solve most problems by hitting them very hard, and it's mostly there for flavour rather than deep characterisation, but it's consistent enough across the entire run of the show that it counts as one of the more stable bits of writing in the whole cast. Theory 51. Gary's actual birth year, the 27th of November 1989, makes him roughly 9 years old when the show begins, which puts him, in raw years lived, ahead of SpongeBob by most of the calculations fans have tried to put together over time. Worth mentioning again briefly here, only because it changes how you read the relationship. Less owner and pet, more like two flatmates, where one happens to be unable to speak English. Theory 52, and a gentle one to close this section on. For all the slapstick, Patrick and SpongeBob's friendship is one of the more consistently warm relationships in the entire show. Surviving fallings out, jealousy episodes, the occasional disastrous business scheme together, and somehow always resetting back to genuine affection by the next episode. It's daft and simple on the surface, but it's also one of the more durable friendships you'll find on children's television, still going strong with no sign of slowing down. Patrick's birthday is given as the 17th of August, which alongside Squidward's October date, makes him one of the slightly better documented members of the cast in terms of hard calendar facts, even though he's usually framed as the character who understands the least about how the world around him actually works. There's also a running joke across the show about Patrick lacking both a nose and visible ears, which becomes the setup for a couple of specific gags, including one episode where he gets a comically oversized pair of ears fitted and immediately announces that he heard a joke landing somewhere off screen, despite having spent the entire rest of the show apparently functioning fine without them. I think Sandy gets slightly less attention in most theory rundowns than she deserves. So a final word on her here. Her actual scientific knowledge within the show, however loosely grounded in real physics, is treated with more consistency and respect by the writers than almost anyone else's expertise in Bikini Bottom, which is a nice quiet tribute, intentional or not, to the fact that the entire show was created by someone who'd spent years actually doing real field work before he ever drew a sponge. It's worth tying this back to what I said earlier about Squidward's actual talent too before we move on. There's a particular episode, Band Geeks, that gets brought up constantly whenever fans rank the show's best entries, where Squidward, desperate to outdo his old rival Squilliam, has to assemble a marching band from scratch using SpongeBob and the rest of Bikini Bottom's least musically gifted residents, with almost no time to prepare. It ends against every reasonable expectation in one of the only properly triumphant moments the character ever gets across the whole series. The band actually pulling off a real performance and earning Squidward a rare, genuine win. It's one of the few times the show lets him have something without immediately undercutting it for a laugh, and for a character so thoroughly defined by failure everywhere else that makes it stand out more than almost anything else he's involved in. Now here's a fun detail for anyone who likes a bit of a chill with their cartoons. Bikini Bottom has its own proper urban legend, and it's better constructed than most actual campfire stories I've heard. Theory 53. In the episode Graveyard Shift, Squidward, bored out of his mind during a forced overnight shift at the Krusty Krab, makes up a ghost story on the spot to wind SpongeBob up. The story goes that a previous fry cook, clumsier even than SpongeBob, once sliced off his own hand while cutting patties, and because he wasn't a sponge, it didn't grow back. He replaced it with a rusty spatula, was hit and killed by a bus shortly after, and then, as the final indignity, was fired from the job at his own funeral. His ghost is said to return to the Krusty Krab every Tuesday night, seeking revenge. The structure of that invented story is worth admiring on its own terms, since it borrows the rhythm of a proper campfire tale almost beat for beat, a workplace tragedy, an unjust ending, a specific recurring night, and a set of concrete, checkable warning signs the listener can watch for themselves. Squidward, despite making the whole thing up on the spot purely to annoy a co-worker, accidentally constructs something that follows the actual conventions of oral horror storytelling fairly closely. Theory 54. The story comes with 3 specific warning signs, told in proper escalating order. The lights will flicker, the phone will ring with nobody on the other end, and finally, a bus will pull up outside carrying the hash-slinging slasher himself, who crosses the road without looking both ways because, as Squidward points out, he's already dead. Theory 55, and this is the bit I find genuinely clever. Squidward tells SpongeBob straight afterwards that he made the whole thing up, and then, that same night, all 3 signs start happening anyway, purely by coincidence, building real tension even though both characters and the audience know logically it's not supposed to be real. Theory 56. The actual culprit behind the late bus and the shadowy figure turns out to be a nervous fish trying to apply for a job, who'd attempted to call ahead earlier, but hung up out of nerves, accidentally recreating 2 of the 3 signs entirely by accident. It's a properly satisfying bit of comedy plotting, dread built up through coincidence, then deflated through the most mundane possible explanation. The way Squidward actually performs the story matters more than people give it credit for. Rather than simply reading the tale flat, he plays it up properly, lowering his voice, drawing out the pauses, milking every beat for maximum effect on a wound-up SpongeBob, which is part of why the episode works as well as it does even decades later. A mediocre ghost story, told with real conviction, will always land better than a clever one told flatly, and Squidward, whatever else you make of him, has never once lacked conviction. Theory 57. There's a genuinely lovely, accidental cultural footnote attached to this episode. The flickering lights turn out to be caused by a vampire character clearly modelled on Count Orlok from the 1922 silent film Nosferatu, who shows up grinning at the end as a pure visual gag. For a huge number of people who grew up on this show, that brief cameo was their actual first exposure to a piece of nearly 100-year-old horror cinema, long before they'd have any reason to encounter it otherwise. The character became enough of a recurring fixture that he's popped up again in later seasons and even in the Camp Coral spin-off as a younger version, sometimes referred to as Kid Ferratu. The joke barely registers as a joke for younger viewers watching it for the first time, which I think is actually why it works so well long term. A kid sees a weird, slightly creepy looking character grinning at the camera and laughs because it's strange, with no idea there's a whole century of cinema history attached to that face. The reference only properly activates years later when that same viewer stumbles across the genuine 1922 film somewhere else entirely and has a small delayed moment of recognition. Theory 58, a strange little detail I only learned recently. A screenshot from this exact episode, the bit where SpongeBob's face is frozen in pure terror mid-scream, ended up reworked into an actual pop art painting years later, which sold at a Sotheby's auction for several $1,000,000. From a wobbly 19-second reaction shot in a kid's cartoon to a gallery wall, I genuinely think that's one of the strangest journeys any single animation frame from this show has ever gone on. Theory 59. Bikini Bottom does have one fully canonical, undisputed actual ghost running through the show. The Flying Dutchman, a proper supernatural figure who collects souls and occasionally torments the residents directly. His existence complicates any theory, suggesting nobody in Bikini Bottom genuinely dies, since he's explicitly framed as the real deal, rather than an urban legend or a misunderstanding. Theory 60, and I'll close this section gently here, since the next bit gets a touch more grown-up. The hash-slinging slasher story has had a long life outside the original episode 2, retold and remixed by fans for years afterward, which is a fairly unusual afterlife for a ghost story that was only ever meant to be a single throwaway gag to wind up a sponge. Worth setting the Dutchman and the slasher side by side for a second, actually, because they sit at opposite ends of how seriously the show takes its own ghosts. The slasher is explicitly fictional within the show's own logic, a story Squidward admits to inventing, scary purely because of coincidence. The Dutchman gets none of that hedging. He's just accepted as a real, walking around fact of life under the sea, no wink to camera required. The Nosferatu cameo deserves a proper postscript too, because it didn't stay a one-off joke. The character became enough of a recurring fixture in the show that for a generation of viewers who'd never have otherwise encountered a 100-year-old German silent film, that brief cameo became their entire frame of reference, to the point where, when a proper modern remake of Nosferatu eventually came out in cinemas, more than one critic, and even people involved in making that new film, pointed back to SpongeBob as where they'd first crossed paths with the character themselves. Funnily enough, the slasher story itself didn't stay contained inside that one episode either. Over the years, fans have written and rewritten their own versions of it online, treating it the same way people treat any genuine playground urban legend, adding extra details, swapping the ending, occasionally claiming a darker, real version exists that the show supposedly softened for broadcast. None of that is remotely true, obviously. It's all just fan fiction built on top of fan fiction at this point. But I find it genuinely interesting that a throwaway gag designed to last about 90 seconds of screen time ended up generating its own small self-sustaining body of internet folklore. The same way actual ghost stories get passed around and embellished generation to generation. In a strange way, the hash-slinging slasher became a real urban legend after all. Just one that happens to know it started life as a cartoon joke. There's also a properly different kind of trivia attached to the slasher, this time from the dubbing booth rather than the writer's room or the internet. Translating a pun-based name, like hash-slinging slasher, into other languages is genuinely difficult since the joke depends on the alliteration as much as the meaning, and different countries handled it in some properly inventive ways. The Croatian dub renamed him entirely as a direct parody of Jack the Ripper instead. The Russian version translates roughly to Harry Chopped Meat, which loses the alliteration but keeps the grim humour intact. The European Portuguese dub went with something that translates to Spatula Killer, blunt and to the point, and the Indonesian broadcast apparently changed his actual cause of death altogether, having him lose his mind and die in a fire rather than getting hit by a bus, which means in at least one country watching this show, the entire ghost story has a quietly different ending to the one most of the world grew up with. Right, since we're on the topic of things hidden in plain sight, let's talk a bit about the jokes that go straight over kids' heads and land squarely on the parents sat next to them on the sofa. Theory 61. This wasn't an accident or a happy bit of misreading on the audience's part. Hillenburg has talked about pitching an episode early on where SpongeBob and Patrick learn a swear word, which got vetoed by the network fairly quickly. After that, rather than dropping the idea entirely, the writers apparently got clever about it, building in jokes that work on a completely different level for adults without ever technically crossing a line a kids' channel would object to. Theory 62. There's a villain in one episode called the Tickler, who fights Sandy on a stretch of land called Condo Island, and he's deliberately written as French. If you happen to know the slang term for a particular type of condom, the joke clicks immediately. If you don't, he's just a slightly odd tickling villain on a beach. Properly dual-layered writing in the most literal sense. Theory 63. There's a much-quoted exchange where Patrick mishears the word genius as something else entirely and instinctively covers himself out of embarrassment. It's quick, it's barely a few seconds of screen time, and it relies entirely on the audience filling in the gap themselves, rather than the show spelling anything out, which I think is generally the more tasteful way to do this sort of joke. What I like about that particular gag is how completely it depends on Patrick's established character, rather than the line itself doing any work. He's not being clever, he's misunderstanding something out of pure simplicity, and the joke only exists because the audience already knows enough about how his brain works to fill in exactly why he reacted that way. Take the joke out of context, hand it to a character who isn't established as being a bit slow on the uptake, and it simply doesn't land the same. Theory 64, a much smaller one. On the actual signage for the Chum Bucket, Plankton's restaurant, eagle-eyed viewers have pointed out that the lowercase h sticks out oddly among all the capital letters, which some read as a quiet, very subtle joke, buried in the background art rather than the dialogue. There's a moment, since I couldn't resist slotting it in nearby, where Patrick and SpongeBob are trying to sell a product door to door, and Patrick earnestly suggests the two of them get undressed to help move stock faster, only for SpongeBob to calmly reply that they should save that particular idea for when they're selling real estate instead. It's delivered so matter-of-factly by both characters that a child watching just hears two friends planning a slightly odd sales pitch, while anyone older clocks the genre of advertising actually being referenced. Theory 65. There's a recurring gag across a few episodes where SpongeBob is shown with underwear pulled over his head, and the specific placement of his long nose inside the garment is, let's say, not an accident of animation. It's the kind of thing that took years for most viewers to even register consciously, myself included, if I'm honest. Theory 66. The general pattern across most of these jokes is that Squidward and Mr. Krabs tend to be the characters delivering the more knowing adult humour. Squidward through dry, sophisticated asides, and Krabs through jokes about money and questionable frugality, while SpongeBob himself mostly stays the innocent, oblivious one the jokes are happening around rather than through. That casting makes sense once you think about who these two characters actually are within the show's own logic. Squidward is meant to read as the closest thing to a world-weary adult in the cast, someone who's seen enough of life to be cynical about it. So dry, knowing humour suits him naturally. Krabs, meanwhile, is old enough and jaded enough by money specifically that jokes routed through his greed land as character appropriate rather than randomly inserted. SpongeBob staying innocent throughout isn't a missed opportunity, it's the whole point, since the show needs at least one character who never catches the joke for the gag to work at all. Theory 67. None of this is really shocking by adult television standards. It's mild, it's quick, And it's clearly built to reward parents rewatching the show with their own kids, rather than to push any real boundary. I think that restraint is actually part of why it's held up so well. It never tips into anything that actually undermines the show being safe, comfortable viewing for children. Theory 68. A fair chunk of the wider internet's hidden adult jokes lists for this show end up repeating themselves with slight variations, the same dozen or so moments getting recirculated under different headlines every couple of years, which says more about how thoroughly this particular bit of the show has been picked over than it does about there being some enormous trove still waiting to be discovered. Theory 69. Some of what gets labelled an adult joke online is honestly just gross-out humour rather than anything actually mature, slime, bodily functions, that sort of thing. And there's a decent ongoing debate among fans about where the genuine line sits between this is for the parents and this is just gross enough that kids find it funnier than adults do. There's a particular flavour of this humour that relies entirely on delivery rather than wording, which I think is worth calling out separately. SpongeBob will occasionally land a line that reads completely innocent on the page. Something about being long, tan and handsome, for instance, but the way it's performed, the pause before it, the slight knowing tone underneath the character's usual cheerfulness, tips it into something a touch more grown-up without a single word actually changing. That kind of joke is much harder to point to as evidence of anything, since there's no text to screenshot, which I think is exactly why it survived this long, without ever causing the show any real trouble with broadcast standards. Theory 70. A couple of smaller examples to round things out here. There's a running gag across one particular episode where hot dogs get consistently referred to as wieners rather than anything more neutral, which works purely because it's said so often and so earnestly that it eventually becomes funny just through sheer repetition. And there's a cheeky bit of date-based numbering tucked into the schedule itself. Season 4's 20th episode happens to be called Best Day Ever, and more than a few fans have clocked the 420 connection and assumed, almost certainly correctly, that it wasn't placed there entirely by accident. And to close this bit out gently, the honest summary is that SpongeBob earns its long shelf life partly because it was built with two separate audiences in mind from fairly early on, and the writers were disciplined enough to keep both layers working without either one undercutting the show's actual rating. That's a harder needle to thread than it looks. One more thought before we leave this topic, since I think it's worth saying properly rather than just listing examples. The reason this layer of humour works at all, rather than feeling tacked on or cynical, is that it never actually requires the joke to land for a child watching. Every single one of these moments functions perfectly well as a completely innocent gag if you don't catch the second meaning, which is a genuinely difficult bit of writing to pull off consistently across more than 200 episodes without ever once tipping over into something that actually needed editing out. Now, since we're already on slightly more grown-up territory, a quieter section about a handful of episodes that don't get scheduled much these days, said plainly and without making too much of it. Theory 71. Quarantined Crab is probably the clearest, most recent example, an episode that involved the Krusty Krab going into quarantine over a sickness outbreak, which got pulled from American broadcast almost entirely once the actual COVID-19 pandemic started in 2020, for fairly obvious reasons of timing and taste. It still aired in some other countries during that window, and it eventually made its way back onto American screens a couple of years later, once that immediate sensitivity had passed. That's less a dark secret and more just sensible, short-term scheduling. Theory 72. A pal for Gary tends to come up a lot in any discussion of the show's lower points, an episode where SpongeBob brings home a second pet that ends up tormenting Gary, while SpongeBob, oblivious, keeps blaming Gary for the chaos. It's consistently ranked among the lowest rated episodes by both critics and the fandom itself, less because of any one shocking moment and more because the tone sits oddly compared to the show's usual rhythm, and the ending doesn't really resolve the unfairness it sets up. What seems to bother people most about that particular episode isn't really the plot mechanics, since Good Pet Gets Unfairly Blamed is a fairly standard cartoon setup that's worked fine elsewhere in the show's history. It's that SpongeBob himself, normally written as naive but fundamentally kind, comes across as actively unreasonable throughout, refusing to believe the evidence in front of him even when Gary's distress is plainly obvious. It's less a one-off bad plot and more a brief, uncharacteristic dent in how the show usually treats its own main character. Theory 73, and I'll keep this one brief and matter-of-fact rather than dwelling on it. One Course Meal is probably the most genuinely controversial episode the show has ever made, built around Mr. Krabs discovering and exploiting Plankton's fear of whales to torment him over an extended stretch, in a way that touches on themes some viewers found genuinely upsetting rather than funny. It's widely considered one of the weaker, more uncomfortable entries in the show's history, and it tends to be scheduled less often than most. I'll leave it there rather than go through the specifics. It's a sensitive topic, and not one this kind of video needs to sit inside for long. Theory 74. It's worth saying plainly that long-running shows almost always accumulate a small handful of episodes. The network quietly stops scheduling over time, sometimes for genuine content reasons, sometimes just because an episode hasn't aged well, sometimes purely because of unlucky timing with real-world events. SpongeBob having a few of these after more than 2 decades on air isn't really unusual. It's closer to inevitable for any show with this kind of episode count. It's worth contrasting this with how some other long-running animated shows have handled their own rough patches, since SpongeBob actually comes off fairly well by comparison. Plenty of shows with similar lifespans have entire seasons widely regarded as creative low points, while SpongeBob's reputation has mostly held steady across its whole run, with the genuinely weak entries staying isolated rather than clustering into one bad stretch the show never recovered from. Theory 75. Plenty of episodes that get labelled controversial online turn out, once you actually rewatch them, to be far milder than their reputation suggests. More a case of 1 or 2 uncomfortable minutes inside an otherwise perfectly normal episode, rather than anything that needed pulling entirely. Theory 76, a lighter one to balance things out. For every genuinely shaky episode, there are 100 that have aged remarkably well. Band Geeks, Chocolate with Nuts, Krusty Krab training video, episodes that still hold up as genuinely well-constructed comedy decades on, which I think gets a bit lost whenever these worst episodes lists do the rounds. Theory 77. Some of the harshest fan criticism around this stretch of the show's run, roughly seasons 6 through 8, tends to focus less on any single banned episode and more on a general sense that the writing leaned meaner during that period, characters being cruel to each other for the sake of a punchline rather than out of genuine character logic, which is a fair, if slightly more boring criticism than "this episode is secretly evil." Theory 78, and I'll close this section here. None of this really threatens the show's overall reputation. A handful of shaky episodes out of well over 200 is a genuinely good batting average for something that's been running continuously since the turn of the millennium. A few smaller, gentler examples to round this section out, since not every bit of episode controversy is as heavy as the ones I've already covered. Sailormouth is a much lighter case, an episode where SpongeBob and Patrick learn what they assume is a swear word from graffiti on a dumpster, with the actual word always censored out by a dolphin noise rather than spoken on screen. No real bad language ever makes it to air, but the entire premise of 2 cartoon characters casually adopting a censored swear word into their daily vocabulary was enough to put some parents off at the time, which feels like a fairly mild complaint compared to most of what we've covered in this section. The The Great Snail Race gets a similar mild flag for showing SpongeBob putting Gary through fairly rigorous, borderline punishing training ahead of a snail race against Squidward's pet, getting frustrated with him for seeming tired partway through. It resolves itself by the end, and SpongeBob does get a bit of comeuppance for pushing too hard, but it's another one of those Gary-centered episodes people point to when they're making the case that the show is a bit rougher on the poor snail than it probably needed to be. Now here's a fun detail before we move off episodes entirely, just a quick look at how far this show has actually travelled beyond the television screen, because the reach of it is genuinely a bit mad once you start listing it out. Hillenburg personally picked up 2 Emmy Awards and 6 Annie Awards across his time on the show, the Annies being the proper dedicated awards for animation specifically, which is a serious haul even before you start counting everything the cast and crew picked up separately on top of that. There's a touring SeaWorld parade that ran for years called Parade Pants, featuring a full Krusty Krab float, a costumed performer playing Pearl greeting guests, and an animatronic Mr. Krabs built into the whole display, which is a properly elaborate bit of theme park engineering for a character whose entire defining trait is refusing to spend money on anything. Tom Kenny has talked a fair bit in interviews about just how far the show's reach actually goes once you get outside the obvious markets, mentioning spotting bootleg SpongeBob merchandise as far afield as Mexico, and seeing the character printed onto hijabs in Egypt, which I think says more about genuine organic global reach than any official licensing figure could. He's also mentioned doing a serious number of comic conventions across the country every year, small towns and big cities alike, and finding it consistently interesting which specific moments from the show different fans bring up as the ones that mattered most to them. Never quite the same answer twice. There's also the slightly stranger end of the show's cultural footprint, the bits that have nothing to do with official merchandising at all. We've already touched on the Sotheby's auction painting built from a single screen grab and the indie band covering the Krusty Krab jingle live. But there's a broader pattern here worth naming properly. A show originally built for very young children, somehow becoming source material for fine art, underground music, and eventually an actual Broadway run with songs from genuinely major recording artists attached. That's an unusually wide net for any piece of children's entertainment to end up caught in, and a small one to round this off. The show quietly passed its 25th year, on air not too long ago, which puts it in genuinely rare company among American animated television, especially given how specific and small the original pitch actually was, an educational tide pool comic that a publisher once turned down. Right, let's lighten the mood properly now and talk about the actual people doing all these voices, because some of these stories are lovely. Theory 79, Tom Kenny, who's voiced SpongeBob from the very first episode, has told the story of where that voice actually came from a few times now, and it's a genuinely odd bit of history. Years before the show existed, Kenny once described to Hillenburg an impression he did of a frustrated man auditioning to play one of Santa's elves at a Christmas advert casting, just as a funny story between friends. Hillenburg apparently filed that voice away in his memory for years, and when it came time to cast SpongeBob, he specifically asked Kenny to bring that exact voice back. So the most recognisable voice in modern children's television started life as an anecdote about a stressed-out elf audition that nobody outside that room was ever meant to remember. Theory 80. SpongeBob's laugh, that distinctive, slightly honking giggle, is produced by Kenny physically patting his own throat while making the sound, a proper bit of old-fashioned vocal technique, rather than anything added in post-production. Theory 81. Kenny doesn't just voice SpongeBob, he's also Gary the Snail's meowing, the French narrator doing the Cousteau-style commentary, and Patchy the Pirate, the live-action human host who turns up in special episodes. 4 very different vocal registers from one person, which is a fairly serious technical achievement even by voice acting standards. Patchy the pirate deserves a quick word of his own, since he's a genuinely odd creative choice when you think about it. A live-action human character, played by Kenny in full costume and makeup, who hosts special episodes and direct-to-camera segments as though he's an actual fan of the show, existing somewhere in the real world rather than inside Bikini Bottom. It's a strange bit of meta-framing for a kids' program to commit to, breaking the cartoon entirely to cut to a man in a pirate hat talking to camera, and yet it's stuck around as a recurring fixture for the better part of the show's run. Theory 82, a nice bit of real-life overlap. Kenny is married to Jill Talley, who voices Karen, Plankton's computer wife. They met years before the show existed, working together on a sketch comedy program, and have stayed married and working together ever since, which makes the Plankton and Karen household, in a roundabout way, performed by an actual married couple. Theory 83. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, the two retired superheroes SpongeBob and Patrick Worship, were voiced by Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway, two proper old Hollywood names who'd previously starred together in the 1960s sitcom McHale's Navy. The casting wasn't a coincidence. Hillenburg and the creative team were apparently fans of that earlier show and went after the pair specifically because of it. There's a nice generational layering built into that casting choice, whether intentional or not. Two actors known to an older audience from a decades-old sitcom were brought in to voice two characters who are themselves washed-up, semi-retired heroes from an earlier era, looked up to mainly by children who have no idea who the actors playing them actually are. The fictional fame of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy and the real fame of Borgnine and Conway end up running on almost exactly the same track, an older generation's icons, repackaged for a new one that experiences them completely fresh. Theory 84, and this is the bit I find genuinely touching. After Ernest Borgnine passed away in 2012, and then Tim Conway in 2019, the production made a deliberate decision not to recast either role with a sound-alike. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy still turn up occasionally, but limited to silent cameos or other characters wearing their costumes, rather than anyone trying to replicate those two specific voices. It was apparently Hillenburg's call, made out of straightforward respect for the original performers, and the show has stuck with it consistently ever since. Theory 85, and this one's properly lovely if you don't already know it. After Stephen Hillenburg passed away in November 2018 from complications related to ALS, fans started a petition asking for SpongeBob's stadium anthem, Sweet Victory, to be performed during the Super Bowl halftime show that following February as a tribute. The petition gathered well over 1 million signatures. The song itself wasn't performed during the actual televised halftime set, which understandably disappointed a lot of people at the time, but a short SpongeBob clip referencing it was used as part of the broadcast, and crucially, the full unedited version of the song was played properly inside the stadium after the game had finished, with a dedication to Hillenburg attached. A handful of sports teams elsewhere, including at least one NHL side, picked up the song afterward and played their own tributes at later games once the moment had built that kind of momentum. What strikes me most about that whole episode is how much of it happened entirely outside the show's control. Fans organising the petition themselves, other teams picking up the song independently, none of it scripted or planned by anyone at Nickelodeon. It became one of those rare moments where the audience's own affection for a creator effectively wrote its own tribute, with the actual network mostly playing catch-up to a wave of feeling it didn't generate and couldn't fully contain. Theory 86. The original performer of Sweet Victory, David Glenn Isley, was reportedly moved enough by the whole episode that he put together and released a new orchestral version of the song afterward, which feels like a fairly rare thing, a one-off cartoon needle drop from 2001, eventually getting its own proper orchestral re-release, nearly 2 decades later, because of how much it meant to people. It's worth remembering that Isley likely had no idea, back when he originally recorded that song, that it would end up becoming this attached to a single cartoon episode about a marching band competition. Most needle drops used in animation pass by largely unnoticed by the original artist. Background music doing its job and nothing more. Watching one specific placement grow into something significant enough to warrant its own dedicated re-release decades later is a genuinely unusual trajectory for any piece of licensed music. Theory 87. A smaller closing detail on the cast. Several of the principal voice actors have been together on this show for its entire run, decades at this point, which is a genuinely unusual amount of continuity for any production, let alone an animated one, where recasting is normally so easy to do quietly. Theory 88, and I'll bring this section to a gentle close. Hillenburg reportedly sat in the recording booth with Kenny and Bill Fagerbakke, who voices Patrick, for the show's earlier seasons, doodling while they recorded and laughing along in real time, which both actors have separately described as one of the more formative parts of finding these characters. It's a small ordinary image, 3 blokes in a room being silly together, and it ended up underpinning a quarter century of children's entertainment. There's a lot of genuinely nice trivia about the cast still left to cover, so let me fold the rest in here before moving on. Carolyn Lawrence, who voices Sandy, has talked about how unusual the recording process is on this show compared to most animation. Normally, voice actors record their lines separately, sometimes days or even weeks apart from each other, purely down to scheduling. On SpongeBob, the cast has apparently always tried to record together as a full ensemble whenever they possibly can, which goes some way to explaining why the back and forth between characters tends to feel so naturally timed rather than stitched together in an editing booth. A few of the principal cast have picked up proper award recognition over the years too. Not just Tom Kenny, who's won multiple Daytime Emmys and an Annie Award specifically for his work as SpongeBob, but Mary Jo Catlett, who voices Mrs. Puff, picked up an Annie nomination of her own early in the show's run, and Roger Bumpass, Squidward's voice, was nominated for a Daytime Emmy as well a few years later. And a more recent bit of trivia to bring this up to date. For the show's 20th anniversary, in 2019, there was a special called SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout, which included a scene where every main voice actor played a live-action version of their own character, all together on screen for the first time, put together specifically as a tribute to Hillenburg, who'd passed away the previous year. And more recently still, in 2024, Kenny and Bill Fagerbakke, who voices Patrick, ended up hosting that year's Kids' Choice Awards in character, performing live via motion capture rather than simply appearing as themselves, which I think is a genuinely novel way for a cartoon duo this far into their run to still be finding new things to do. Mermaid Man's real-life actor deserves a proper mention too, rather than just as a cartoon footnote. Ernest Borgnine had a genuinely serious Hollywood career, stretching back decades before he ever sat down to record a cartoon, an Academy Award winner, a BAFTA and Golden Globe winner too, with a string of proper film credits behind him. And before any of that, he'd actually served in the real United States Navy himself, which makes for a strange little echo sitting right next to Mr. Krabs' own fictional Navy backstory. 2 separate threads of this show, one entirely invented, one entirely real, both quietly built around a man who served at sea long before he ever found his way to acting. There's also a smaller, slightly sadder footnote worth mentioning here. After Borgnine's death, a separate mobile game called SpongeBob moves in, apparently did recast Mermaid Man with a different voice actor for that one specific piece of media, which makes the main show's decision to never recast him at all stand out even more by comparison. One small corner of the wider franchise made a different call to the main series, and the main series simply chose restraint instead. It's worth zooming out on Kenny specifically before we leave this topic, because SpongeBob is genuinely just one entry on an extraordinarily long list for him. Outside this show entirely, he's voiced the Ice King across the whole run of Adventure Time, played Spyro the Dragon across several video games, voiced both the mayor and the narrator on the Powerpuff Girls, played Heifer the Cow on Rocko's Modern Life, before SpongeBob ever existed, and by some counts has well over 350 separate voice acting credits to his name at this point. He's described his own career, half joking, as ending up voicing a lot of sweet yellow characters for some reason, which tracks given how many of his most famous roles share that exact description. There's a fairly recent bit of trivia worth slotting in here too, because Paramount owns both Nickelodeon and the network that broadcast Super Bowl LVIII in 2024. Nickelodeon ran its own alternative, family-friendly broadcast of the actual NFL game alongside the main coverage, presented in part by SpongeBob and Patrick themselves, with Kenny and Bill Fagerbakker voicing both characters live in character, reacting to real football in real time via motion capture rather than pre-recorded animation. A genuinely strange, very modern way for a long-running cartoon duo to end up commentating on American sport, and about as far from a Tide Pool comic book as this whole thing could possibly have travelled. Right, since we've just spent a while on the people behind the voices, let's talk a little about everywhere else this franchise has actually gone, because it's spread a lot further than most people clock unless they've been paying attention the whole way through. The first proper feature film, simply called the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, came out in 2004, and it's the one with David Hasselhoff playing a fairly exaggerated version of himself, at one point literally being used as a makeshift jet ski, racing across the ocean's surface to get SpongeBob and Patrick home in time. It's a genuinely strange cameo, even by this franchise's standards, and apparently became one of the more beloved bits of the whole film, precisely because of how unbothered Hasselhoff seemed to be about the indignity of it all. Worth adding that the choice of Hasselhoff specifically wasn't random. He was already a fairly established figure in the kind of earnest, slightly over-the-top action television the film was gently sending up, and the joke depends entirely on the audience already knowing who he is and what he represents before he ever turns up dripping wet on a beach being used as transport. Casting someone with less cultural baggage in that exact role simply wouldn't have landed the same way. The second film, Sponge Out of Water, released in 2015, brought in a human pirate villain called Burgerbeard, who actually manages to succeed where Plankton never could across the entire series, stealing the Krabby Patty formula outright and trying to set up his own version of the business on dry land. It's one of the only points across the whole franchise where the formula genuinely leaves Bikini Bottom and crosses properly into the human world, which makes it a fairly significant exception to how contained the show's geography usually stays. Here's a fun detail I only came across properly while putting this together, and I think it's a lovely bit of quiet contradiction sitting in the middle of the franchise. Earlier on, I went through the friend or foe version of the Krabby Patty origin, Krabs and Plankton as young business partners, the poisoned customer, the chaotic kitchen accident that produced the formula by happy accident. But more recent material, specifically the Sponge on the Run film and an episode of Camp Coral called Kitchen Sponge, apparently reveal that SpongeBob himself is the true original creator of the formula, not Krabs at all. Two completely different origin stories for the same recipe, sitting in the same franchise years apart, and as far as I can tell, nobody's ever properly reconciled the two, which feels about right for a show that's never been especially precious about internal consistency. A more recent entry, SpongeBob SquarePants, The Cosmic Shake, came out as a video game in 2023 rather than a film, but it's worth a mention since it kept the cast actively working together well into the show's third decade, with most of the principal voice actors returning for it. On the television side, Camp Coral, the prequel we've already touched on a few times for its age retcons, ran as its own dedicated series rather than just a one-off special, properly fleshing out the summer camp setting where SpongeBob, Patrick and the rest of the gang first crossed paths as kids. And then there's The Patrick Star Show, a fairly recent spin-off that hands Patrick his own chaotic talk show format, complete with an entire extended star family that the original series never really bothered building out. Patrick gets a whole cast of relatives in this version, a younger sister called Squidina, parents generally referred to as Cecil and Bunny Star, and a sprawling, slightly absurd family tree that includes adoptive siblings drawn from across the existing cast, including versions of SpongeBob, Squidward, and even Plankton folded into the household at various points. It's a properly odd piece of world building for a character whose entire original appeal was being the daft simple one, with apparently no family to speak of beyond a rock to live under. I think the wider franchise, taken as a whole, says something fairly nice about how much trust this property's been given over the years. Most shows that run this long start cannibalizing themselves a bit, recycling plots, leaning on nostalgia rather than building anything new. SpongeBob's spin-offs, for whatever you make of any individual one, have mostly tried to actually expand the world rather than just repeat it, even if that occasionally means quietly contradicting an episode from 20 years earlier. Since we've covered the cast properly now, let's talk a little about the people drawing all of this, because there's some proper craft buried in details most viewers never consciously register. Every main character on this show was deliberately given their own distinct walk cycle early on, a specific way of moving that's meant to communicate personality before a single line of dialogue is spoken. Mr. Krabs is a good example. He moves with this quick, scuttling gait, drawn almost as though he's got more than the standard 2 legs, which the storyboard artist responsible apparently built specifically to read as cartoonish and slightly frantic, matching his general anxious relationship with money and time. There's also a nice bit of production history around where Krabs and Pearl actually live. In Hillenburg's very earliest pitch materials, the map he originally showed Nickelodeon executives back in 1997 didn't include the Hollow Anchor house at all. It had the Krusty Krab itself doubling as both Krab's workplace and his home. The anchor only got added once the first season was already in production, which means one of the more visually memorable houses in the whole show was essentially a late addition, bolted on after the bones of the world had already been set. And since we're on the subject of how much care went into building this thing, it's probably the right moment to say something about the people who've spent the years since taking it apart again, piece by piece, which is to say, the fandom. A video like this one genuinely wouldn't exist without an absolutely enormous amount of unpaid voluntary cataloguing work that's been going on quietly in the background for decades now. There are entire dedicated wikis built purely around this one show, with thousands upon thousands of individual articles, separate pages for things as small as a single throwaway prop that appeared in one scene of one episode, full family trees mapped out for characters who've had maybe 4 lines of dialogue across the entire run. There are long-running forums where fans have spent literal years arguing about exactly how old Squidward is supposed to be, cross-referencing background dialogue, driver's licenses, birthday episodes, school flashbacks, all in pursuit of an answer the writers themselves were apparently never that interested in pinning down. I find something genuinely lovely about that level of devotion. It isn't really about getting a definitive answer. It's people who love a thing enough to want to understand it more completely than it was probably ever designed to be understood, which I think says something properly nice about how well the show holds up underneath all the slapstick. Right, we're well past the halfway point now, so this last section is a bit of a grab bag, odds and ends, that didn't fit neatly anywhere else. Before I land on something a bit more reflective to close on. Theory 89. By most counts, SpongeBob SquarePants is the fourth longest running American animated series ever made, which is a genuinely strange thing to sit with, given how small and specific its original premise was. A marine biology teacher's tide pool comic that couldn't find a publisher. It's worth naming what's actually ahead of it on that list, since the company is fairly exclusive. Shows like The Simpsons and a small handful of other genuine television institutions being mentioned in the same breath as those, for a program that started life as an educational aid for school groups visiting a marina, says something about just how far the original idea travelled from its starting point. Theory 90. The show eventually became a full Broadway musical in 2017, with songs contributed by a properly enormous range of musicians, and it picked up 12 Tony nominations, tying it for the most nominated production of that particular year. It didn't end up winning Best Musical, but for a stage show built around a cartoon sponge, that's a remarkable showing regardless. What strikes me about the musical specifically is how seriously it was taken by people who, on paper, had absolutely no obligation to take it seriously at all. Genuinely major songwriters contributing original work to a stage show about SpongeBob suggests the underlying material was respected as something worth doing properly, rather than treated as an easy cash-in riding on name recognition alone. Theory 91. The Krusty Krab has had a few odd brushes with the real world over the years. There's a full-size replica of the restaurant that was actually built in Ramallah in Palestine back in 2014, and separately, a group in Texas once tried opening their own for-profit restaurant using the Krusty Krab name and branding, which led to an actual federal lawsuit from Viacom, the company that owns the rights. A judge ruled against the Texas restaurant in early 2017, which is a strange sentence to type out. A fictional fast food joint from a kid's cartoon having enough legal weight behind it to shut down a real one. The Texas case is worth a beat longer because the people behind it apparently genuinely thought they'd found a loophole, on the theory that the Krusty Krab itself was never a registered trademark in quite the way the rest of the franchise was. The court disagreed, ruling that the name and the overall look of the restaurant were protected regardless, which closed off what had briefly looked like a fairly creative bit of legal opportunism. Theory 92. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy get a full joke origin story in one episode, and it's worth knowing because it's properly silly even by this show's standards. As the story goes, the two of them, sharing a flat as young men, were about to settle in for a film night when their upstairs neighbour, a scientist working with radioactive ants, knocked over an experiment. One ant bit one of them through a crack in the ceiling, sending them both stumbling out of a window into a vat at a nearby acid factory, which itself got knocked over by a passing UFO, sweeping them through town on a wave of acid during a solar eclipse that also happened to fall on a leap year, while they were struck by lightning and rained on by radioactive ooze. They apparently made it home afterward to find their popcorn had burned. It's a full parody of every overcomplicated superhero origin story stacked on top of itself, and it somehow still ends on the most mundane possible punchline. The joke only really lands if you've sat through enough comic book origin stories yourself to recognise exactly what's being mocked. The random animal bite, the chemical accident, the freak weather event, all the well-worn ingredients of 100 different superhero backstories crammed into one increasingly absurd paragraph. It's a properly knowing piece of parody hiding inside what looks, on the surface, like a throwaway gag about two old men and some burnt popcorn. Theory 93. When Ernest Borgnine first recorded Mermaid Man's signature, drawn-out evil shout, his voice actually cracked partway through the take. Rather than redo it cleanly, the team decided they liked the cracked version better and kept it in, which is now permanently part of the character. Borgnine separately described doing voice work in general as feeling a bit like stealing money, since to him the job was simply talking, while the character came alive entirely through that voice, rather than anything physical he had to do. There's something genuinely nice about a performer that experienced choosing the imperfect take on instinct rather than chasing a technically cleaner one. A lot of voice direction leans toward polish, toward getting the smoothest possible delivery on record, and the fact that the rougher, more human-sounding version is the one that stuck, and the one fans still associates with the character decades later, says something about how much texture and accident matter in performance, even in a medium where you'd think every flaw could simply be re-recorded away. Theory 94. There's a more recent development worth a mention, a real ocean conservation initiative tied to the franchise called Operation Sea Change, launched as a genuine effort connecting the show's marine biology roots back to actual conservation work. It's a nice bit of full-circle thinking, given the entire project started with a man trying to get kids excited about tide pools. Theory 95. Hillenburg was apparently fairly wary of the show's own merchandising machine, even while it was making the franchise an enormous amount of money. He's been quoted saying his biggest nightmare was being at the beach one day and seeing one of the plastic SpongeBob dolls wash up on the shore like rubbish, which tracks given his background as someone who'd spent years caring specifically about ocean environments. He was also reportedly resistant to the idea of spin-offs for a long while, joking to people on the production team that the day someone pitched SpongeBob Babies was the day he'd walk away from the franchise entirely. There's a real tension sitting underneath that anxiety, a creator who built something specifically to get children to care about the ocean, watching that same creation spin off an enormous quantity of plastic merchandise, much of which would presumably end up, eventually, in that exact ocean. I don't think there's a tidy resolution to that contradiction, and I doubt Hillenburg ever found one either, but it says something good about him, that the discomfort was apparently real rather than just a passing joke. Theory 96. The actual on-screen text describing the Krabby Patty formula carries a small joke buried in the legal language itself, something to the effect that the formula is the sole property of the Krusty Krab, only to be discussed with its creator, and that duplication is punishable by law. Restrictions apply, results may vary. It reads exactly like the small print on a real product, which is presumably the entire point. That kind of joke, parodying corporate legal language rather than anything more obviously cartoonish, is squarely aimed over the heads of younger viewers who have no real frame of reference yet for what a disclaimer or a terms and conditions notice even is. It's the sort of gag that only fully lands once you've spent a few years as an adult reading the back of medicine boxes and software agreements, which makes it one of the more delayed action jokes in the entire show. Theory 97. And this one I find genuinely funny because it's a contradiction sitting right out in the open. Tom Kenny has told at least 2 different stories over the years about where SpongeBob's voice actually came from. One version is the Elf audition anecdote I mentioned earlier, a frustrated man Kenny once impersonated for Hillenburg as a funny story between friends, years before the show existed. But there's also an account tracing it back to a much smaller voice Kenny did for a minor alligator character called Al on Rocko's Modern Life, the show Hillenburg worked on right before SpongeBob, with Hillenburg apparently showing Kenny an old clip of that character specifically to remind him of the voice he wanted. Whether it's one origin story slightly misremembered across so many years of interviews, or genuinely 2 separate threads that both fed into the final voice, nobody's ever fully untangled it, including, I suspect, Kenny himself. Theory 98. Back in 2011, the indie band Yo La Tengo performed a live cover of the Krusty Krab's fake television advert jingle from the episode As Seen on TV at an actual venue in Los Angeles, which is a strangely specific bit of crossover between underground music and Nickelodeon ephemera that I don't think anyone could have predicted. The detail I find most charming about that whole episode is how completely unnecessary it was, in the sense that nobody needed an indie band to cover a 30-second jingle from a kids' show for any commercial reason. It only happened because the musicians involved genuinely liked the original bit enough to bother learning and performing it live, which is about as pure a form of fan appreciation as exists. Theory 99. For all the conspiracy-flavoured theories that circle this show, the nuclear testing, the depression hidden in Mr. Krabs' backstory, the ghost story that accidentally introduced people to silent cinema, the actual through line connecting nearly all of it traces back to one source: a marine biology teacher who liked drawing weird little sea creatures for his students and who kept folding bits of real ocean science and real personal history into a cartoon almost as a force of habit, whether or not the network or the audience ever clocked it. And before I wrap up properly, a last small handful of loose threads I kept setting aside and never found a clean home for, so they can live here together at the end. There's a fairly sweet detail about how Hillenburg approached the show's tone generally, insisting that no matter how the comedy escalated around them, SpongeBob and Patrick themselves were never allowed to become knowing or cynical characters. Tom Kenny has described the early notes Hillenburg gave him, and Bill Fagerbakker almost jokingly as the tablets that came down from the mountain, the basic, unmovable commandments of who these two characters were and weren't allowed to become, even as the writing around them got wilder season by season. To this day, by Kenny's own account, those original parameters still hold. There's also something worth saying about the gap between how this show's talked about and how it was actually made. Online, especially in fan circles, there's a tendency to treat every detail as either a dark secret waiting to be uncovered or a deliberate puzzle the writers planted on purpose. But most of what actually held this thing together for decades, by the accounts of the people who were there, was much smaller than that. Steady collaborators, a creator who stayed closely involved long after he technically didn't need to, actors who liked each other enough to keep showing up. None of that makes for as exciting a headline as a nuclear conspiracy theory, but I'd argue it's the actual reason the show has lasted this long, not any single clever twist. And a final loose fact to close the grab bag properly. Despite being designed initially as nothing more than an educational comic for visiting school groups at a tide pool center in California, the underlying concept eventually grew into a genuine multi-billion-dollar media franchise, stretching across television, 3 feature films, a Broadway musical, multiple spin-off series, and by some counts has been estimated as one of the most profitable media franchises ever built from a single animated character. Which is a strange, slightly funny endpoint for an idea that started because a marine biology teacher wanted his students to care a bit more about what lives under a rock at low tide. I think that's genuinely the through line worth sitting with as we wrap up. More than any single nuclear theory or ghost story or hidden joke, a bloke who loved the ocean enough to spend years teaching kids about it, who happened to also be a decent enough artist to turn that love into a character, and who then spent the rest of his career quietly trying to keep that same sense of curiosity intact, even once the toys and the theme parks and the Broadway lights got involved. I don't think that's a theory exactly. It's just, as far as I can tell, more or less what actually happened. So that's the lot. 100 of them, and then some more or less in the order they occurred to me, rather than ranked by how interesting they are. I hope at least a few of those were new to you, and if you already knew most of them, well, you're clearly the kind of person who actually pays attention to the small print in their favourite cartoons, which I respect. What stuck with me most, putting all of this together, isn't any single theory on its own. It's how often the genuinely well-documented facts ended up stranger than the made-up fan theories sitting right next to them. A confirmed nuclear test site is objectively a wilder thing to build a kids' show on top of than any Reddit theory about Patrick being secretly ancient. A real war veteran's quiet depression, written into a few lines of throwaway dialogue, is heavier than any joke theory about Mr. Krabs selling his soul. I went into this thinking the fan speculation would be the interesting bit, and the production trivia would just be filler in between, and by the end I'd more or less flipped that the other way round. I think that's probably true of most things people end up loving for decades, rather than just a season or two. The actual making of it, the real choices and real people behind it, usually turns out to be just as strange as anything anyone's ever theorized about it afterward, if you bother to go and look properly. There's a particular kind of comfort in a show that's been picked over this thoroughly and still holds up underneath it all. Most things don't survive that level of scrutiny. Most things, the closer you look, start to come apart a bit. The jokes age badly. The production turns out to be more cynical than you'd hoped. The people involved turn out to be less interesting than the work suggested. SpongeBob by and large doesn't do that. The closer you look, the more it tends to hold together, which I think is rarer than people give it credit for. I've got a few more of these brewing, some other shows I keep meaning to do a proper deep dive on, so there'll probably be another one of these along at some point. For now though, if you're still listening, I hope you're properly comfortable, wherever you're lying,